All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our discussion about genetics. We are just about finished with this initial introduction to genetics. We have talked about what genetics is, that it is the study of heredity. We've talked about the father of genetics and his research that he did with pea plants. And then we've learned a lot of vocabulary along the way. We have started to review some of that vocabulary, and we're going to continue to do some reviewing of vocabulary today. You're also going to practice Punnett squares, using Punnett squares a little bit more. We've done some with that while trying to find George's real family. And so you'll continue with that today, getting some more practice, and all of that will get us ready for our lab activity that we're going to do on Monday and Tuesday. So make sure that you have your notes page out from yesterday, and we're going to pick up where we left off, which is reviewing this idea of dominant and recessive genes. And so this whole concept of dominant and recessive basically helps to describe how likely it is that certain phenotypes are going to be passed from one generation to the next, from parents to offspring. And remember, phenotype has to do with what you can see and observe, what kinds of traits can be seen and observed in an organism, and those are often affected by the genotype, what the genes are and the alleles that the person has inherited. So, ladies and gentlemen, just a reminder that dominant refers to an allele or a trait where only one copy of the dominant allele has to be present in order for that trait to show up. And so you can have either two copies of that dominant allele or just one copy of that dominant allele, and that dominant trait will be present. Whereas with recessive, you actually have to have two copies of the recessive gene, two copies of the recessive allele, in order to have that trait show up in the organism. So dominant, you only need one copy. Recessive, you would need two. We've also talked quite a bit about a few examples of inherited traits. Inherited traits are characteristics that are determined by your genetics. All right, and those traits are determined by genetic information that you receive from both parents. Once again, I've said this many times, you receive 50% of your genetic information from your mom and 50% from your dad. And so it is that combination that determines what traits you have inherited. So you get those genes from both parents. And we've talked about all kinds of different examples of inherited traits. We've talked about skin color and hair texture. We've talked about eye color and height. We've talked about freckles or not freckles. Remember, let's keep in mind, and even if we go back to the previous slide, remember that in humans, most traits are affected by more than one gene, sometimes on more than one chromosome. So when we say that blue eyes are recessive and brown eyes are dominant, well, that is true. However, it is not the same as talking about Mendel's pea plants, where just one gene affected each of those, one set of genes. So keep in mind that skin, hair, eye color, height, freckles, all of these tend to be affected by several genes, but they are still inherited from the combination of genes that you receive from both parents. All right, some more vocabulary review. We've talked about these terms a couple of times, but you know, they're not words that we use in everyday life. So let's take a little bit of review here. Homozygous dominant. Homozygous dominant means that the organism carries 2 copies of the same dominant allele. So for instance, in this example with these purple and white flowers here, they are using the letter B. Not sure why they picked the letter B exactly, but they did. And so they have chosen to have the letter B, and the capital B would refer to the dominant trait, which apparently here is purple. Lowercase b then would refer to the recessive trait, or white. So a homozygous dominant plant here would have 2 capital B's. Remember again, that prefix homo means same, so it's going to have 2 of the same letters. Homozygous recessive, or sometimes we don't even need the word homozygous on this one, we can just say recessive. This is an organism that carries 2 copies of the same recessive allele. So in this case, it would have to be 2 lowercase b's. In order for them to have the recessive trait, they have to have 2 of the same, which is why we don't necessarily have to say the word homozygous here, because it can be implied. And then heterozygous, or sometimes we call it heterozygous dominant. That is when an organism carries 2 different alleles. So in this case, it would be a capital B and a lowercase b. Again, sometimes we say heterozygous dominant because we want to make sure that we remember that when you have a heterozygous situation, you have 2 different letters, because again, hetero means different. When you have 2 different letters, then the dominant trait is the one that is going to show up. The dominant allele will be the one that that we actually see. That will be our phenotype. So these are some big words, but important words when it comes to genetics. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, the last little bit that we're going to look here is just a quick review of what a Punnett square is. We know it's a diagram that can be used to determine the probability or the chance of an offspring having a particular phenotype, or really even a particular genotype we can determine as well with a Punnett square. So here we have a capital A representing red flowers and a lowercase a representing green flowers. So what is the chance or the probability of the flowers being green? We have parent 1 over here that has a lowercase a and a lowercase a. You have parent 2 with a capital A and a lowercase a. So you have parent 1 is recessive or homozygous recessive. You have parent 2 who is heterozygous or heterozygous dominant. What are the chances of the flowers being green? Well, they've given you a little help by shading it in with color, but I think you could figure it out even on your own, because 2 of the 4 boxes has the lowercase a, or the homozygous recessive genotype, and therefore 2 out of 4 means it's going to be 50%. We always express these probabilities as a percentage, so we would write it as 50%. A simple Punnett square such as this one here examines just one of many, many, many genes that can be passed on during, or that are passed on during sexual reproduction. There are Punnett squares that can be, this is called a monohybrid Punnett square. There are dihybrid Punnett squares, and you can even have a Punnett where 2 traits are we're finding the probability of. So for instance, finding the probability of a pea plant having purple flowers and being tall, let's say. You can even do a even larger Punnett square where you're testing three different traits and finding the probability, and you can continue on making your Punnett squares bigger and bigger. We'll talk about that a little bit more in our next lesson. Punnett squares show all of the possible ways that the offspring could inherit the gene from their two parents. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, go ahead and put these notes away, and in a few minutes you're going to be reviewing a little bit about how to put these Punnett squares to use, especially monohybrid Punnett squares, as we have been doing. I hope that you guys have a great rest of your day. Bye.